Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Tonight we are examining a set of developments that, taken together, mark one of the most consequential weeks of the war so far. The loss of a key Russian land and logistics link valued at roughly $20 billion in long-term trade and transport capacity, and a sudden Ukrainian strike on a major Russian oil facility that Moscow itself has described as among the most damaging attacks on its energy infrastructure to date. This is not a story about spectacle. It is a story about infrastructure, supply lines, energy flows, and the way modern wars are increasingly decided far from the front lines, in rail yards, ports, refineries, and control rooms. To understand why these events matter, we need to step back and look at what has actually been hit, how it fits into Russia's war economy, and what Ukraine is trying to achieve at this stage of conflict. Let us begin with the so-called main link that Russian officials and analysts have been quietly worrying about for months. This link is not a single bridge or a single rail line. It is a network, a combination of rail corridors, road connections, and port access routes that connect Russia's industrial heartland with occupied territories and key export destinations. Over years, Moscow invested heavily in this network, both for civilian trade and for strategic military mobility. Independent estimates before the war placed the long-term economic value of these routes, in terms of trade facilitation and energy exports, at around $20 billion. Over the past year, Ukraine has steadily targeted this network. Sometimes the attacks were visible and dramatic, such as strikes on bridges or rail hubs. At other times, they were quieter. Sabotage, cyber disruption, or repeated pressure that made routes unreliable rather than completely unusable. What changed this week is that several of these pressures converged at once. A critical rail segment was put out of service. A parallel road route was damaged. Insurance costs for shipping through nearby ports spiked. And as a result, Russian logistics planners were forced to acknowledge what Ukrainian officials had been claiming for months: the link as a reliable artery for large-scale movement of fuel. Ammunition and heavy equipment is effectively gone for now. Russian state media has avoided the phrase collapse, but the language used by transport and industry insiders has been unusually frank. Freight volumes dropped sharply, repair timelines were described as uncertain. Temporary rerouting was admitted to be slower and more expensive. In wartime, these are not just economic inconveniences. They shape how fast units can be reinforced, how consistently they can be supplied, and how much pressure a military can sustain over time. This brings us to the second part of the story: Ukraine's strike on a major oil plant deep inside Russia. According to Russian regional authorities, the facility was hit by multiple long-range drones during the night. Fires broke out in several processing units, and operations were suspended. While Moscow has not officially named the plant as the largest of its kind, industry data confirms it is among the country's most significant refineries, supplying both domestic markets and export contracts. What makes this strike particularly important is not just the size of the facility, but its timing. Russia's energy sector has been under sustained pressure from sanctions, price caps, and the costs of rerouting exports. Refineries have been working harder to compensate for lost markets and logistical inefficiencies. Hitting a major oil plant at this moment amplifies existing strains. Even a temporary shutdown can disrupt fuel supplies, reduce export revenues, and force difficult trade-offs between civilian consumption and military needs. Ukrainian officials have been careful in their public statements. They have not claimed record-breaking power or unprecedented destruction. Instead, they have framed the strike as part of a systematic campaign to degrade Russia's ability to finance and sustain the war. From Kiev's perspective, every refinery taken offline, even briefly, reduces the flow of money that pays for missiles, drones, and artillery shells falling on Ukrainian cities. It is also worth noting how this strike fits into Ukraine's evolving military strategy. Early in the war, Ukraine focused primarily on defending territory and disrupting Russian advances near the front. As the conflict dragged on, and as Western partners provided longer-range capabilities, Kyiv began to think more broadly about the battlefield. Energy infrastructure emerged as a key target, not because it is symbolic, but because it is central to Russia's war economy. Striking energy facilities carries risks. It can escalate tensions and provoke retaliation. It can also affect global markets, raising concerns among Ukraine's partners. That is why Kyiv has often moved cautiously, choosing targets that are militarily relevant while trying to avoid massive civilian harm. In this case, the attack occurred at night when staffing levels were lower, and there have been no confirmed reports of civilian casualties. From Moscow's side, the response has been predictable but telling. Officials have condemned the attack as terrorism and promised swift repairs. At the same time, there has been a noticeable increase in air defense deployments around energy sites and transport hubs. This redeployment itself has costs. Air defense systems moved to protect refineries are systems not available closer to the front or to defend other critical infrastructure. The loss of the logistics link and the strike on the oil plant are not isolated events. They are part of a broader pattern that has been developing since late last year. Ukraine has been steadily expanding the range and sophistication of its long-range strike capabilities. Russian defenses, while still formidable, are being stretched across a vast territory. Each successful attack forces Moscow to make choices about where to allocate limited resources. For ordinary Russians, the immediate effects may be subtle at first. Fuel prices might rise slightly in some regions. Certain goods may take longer to arrive, but over time, these disruptions accumulate. A war economy depends on predictability. When transport links are unreliable and energy production is disrupted, planning becomes harder, costs rise, and inefficiencies multiply. Internationally, these developments are being watched closely. Energy markets are sensitive to any news of refinery outages in major producing countries. So far, the impact on global prices has been limited, partly because of existing spare capacity elsewhere, and partly because traders see the outage as temporary. Still, the trend is clear. The war is increasingly intersecting with global energy security in ways that cannot be ignored. Western governments have reacted cautiously. There has been no public condemnation of Ukraine's actions from its main supporters, but there have been quiet reminders about the importance of stability in global markets. At the same time, many analysts in Europe and North America acknowledge that Ukraine is using one of the few levers it has to pressure a much larger adversary. For Ukraine, the strategic calculation is stark. On the front lines, progress is slow and costly. Russia retains significant manpower and industrial capacity. To change the overall balance, Kyiv needs to affect Russia's ability to sustain the war over the long term. Targeting logistics and energy infrastructure is one way to do that, especially when direct battlefield breakthroughs are hard to achieve. For Russia, the challenge is different. The country has adapted to sanctions and absorbed significant losses, but adaptation has limits. Infrastructure can be repaired, but repeated damage increases costs and strains skilled labor. Insurance premiums rise. Foreign partners become more cautious. Over time, these pressures can erode the foundations of a war effort, even if they do not lead to immediate collapse. It is important to avoid overstating the impact of any single strike or disruption. Russia's economy is large and diversified. One refinery, even a major one, does not determine the outcome of the war. Likewise, the loss of a key logistics link does not mean Russian forces will suddenly be unable to operate. Wars of this scale are decided by accumulation, not by isolated events. However, when viewed together, these developments point to a clear trajectory. Ukraine is increasingly capable of reaching deep into Russian territory. Russia is increasingly forced to defend assets far from the front. The battlefield is expanding, not geographically in terms of occupation, but functionally in terms of what counts as a legitimate military target. There is also a human dimension that should not be overlooked. Behind every damaged rail line and every burning refinery are workers, engineers, and local communities. Even when attacks are aimed at military or economic targets, civilians feel the consequences. This reality complicates the moral and political landscape of the war, reminding us that infrastructure is never purely abstract. As winter approaches and energy demand rises, the pressure on both sides will increase. Ukraine will seek to maintain momentum, using its growing capabilities to impose costs on Russia. Russia will try to harden defenses, repair damage quickly, and reassure its population that the situation is under control. The outcome will depend not just on weapons and tactics, but on endurance, management, and the ability to adapt under stress. In the coming weeks, we should expect more information to emerge about the true extent of the damage to the oil plant and the logistics network. Satellite imagery, industry reports, and trade data will provide a clearer picture. What is already clear is that the war is entering a phase where economic and infrastructural targets play an increasingly central role. This shift has implications beyond Ukraine and Russia. It challenges existing norms about the protection of energy infrastructure. It raises questions about escalation and deterrence. And it forces policymakers around the world to consider how conflicts in one region can ripple through global systems that we all depend on. As always, separating verified facts from speculation is essential. Claims from both sides should be treated with caution and cross-checked where possible. The fog of war is real, and information itself has become a battlefield. Our aim here is not to take sides emotionally, but to understand what is happening and why it matters. The disappearance of a $20 billion logistics link and the strike on a major oil plant are signals, not conclusions. They signal a war that is evolving, a balance that is being tested, and strategies that are adapting to harsh realities. How these signals translate into long-term outcomes remains uncertain, but they deserve careful attention. We will continue to follow these developments closely, drawing on credible sources and expert analysis to provide a clear picture of this conflict as it unfolds. If you found this analysis useful, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more war updates and global analysis.